Let me tell you what we're going to do. We have 3 interventions from the floor, 3 or 4, and then I would like to ask Joseph Stiglitz, of course, Kristalina Georgieva first, Joseph Stiglitz, Jeffrey Sachs, and of course, Monsignor Marcelo Sanchez to close. But first of all, I have a special request from Ambassador José Luis Álvarez, because the Minister of Ecuador, Richard Martinez, sent a brief message, and I hope the ambassador is still in the room. Yes, you are. So, José Luis Álvarez, very short, please, the message.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chairman. I want to thank Monsignor Sanchez Orondo for having invited our country to participate. Unfortunately, our Ministry of Economy, Richard Martinez, couldn't make it, and he has asked me to read a letter for you, for the audience, presenting his salute to you and to all his colleagues. Excellency, aprovecho la oportunidad para felicitar a la organización del seminario Nuevas Formas de Fraternidad Solidaria de Inclusión, Integración e Innovación. Destaco la importancia de contar con estos espacios para identificar cómo el sistema financiero sea más inclusivo, eficiente y sostenible en el mundo dinámico. Con mucho entusiasmo hubiese querido dar a conocer el aporte del Ecuador para lograr este propósito para todas las naciones, en beneficio de sus ciudadanos, con especial atención en el comercio inclusivo, la lucha contra la corrupción y la importancia de tomar acción ante los efectos del cambio climático. Lamento no haber podido asistir a tan importante evento debido a compromisos adquiridos de último momento, fruto de la agenda internacional del presidente de la República, Lenín Moreno Garcés. Esto no solo cambia lo programado, sino que demanda mi urgente atención como autoridad económica para la preparación de dicho encuentro, sino también que requiere adelantar mi gestión en obras de temas relacionados con la función legislativa. Con estos antecedentes presento esta excusa formal y hago propicio la ocasión para desearles el mayor de los éxitos en el desarrollo del seminario, en el cual estoy seguro se transmitirán experiencias, retos y oportunidades para el mundo en materia de política financiera mundial desde un modelo inclusivo y sostenible. Atentamente, Richard Martínez Arévalo. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you for the time.
Muchas gracias, embajador. Thank you so much. And let me now, in the floor, I have one request, which is Enrique Iglesias, and I can take 2 or 3 more from the floor before we go to the closing remarks. Anybody wants to speak? Ministers, Deputy Minister? No? Okay, Enrique Iglesias.
Giving me the floor, I would like to thank very much the Monsignors and the president of this academy, Monsignor Sanchez Orondo, also the president of the Academy of Science, Monsignor Stefano Samagni, and particularly Gustavo Vélez for the big effort to put this wonderful meeting today. We had really the privilege to have with us the Holy Father, and also to listen very important contributions by the ministers of the region of Latin America, by the ministers of France and Spain, and also by the financial institutions. I would like very much to thank the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina, for her presentation, and the 2 major speeches that gave a lot of promotion to our discussion by Stiglitz and Sachs. I think there has been a lot of messages and a lot of common points in these discussions today. We had the major challenges. We all agree to see equity as one major objective, poverty, climate, things which really put together the major challenges we have ahead of us. Really, what really impresses me is that all these things really put together what the Minister of France said. There is a challenge to a new type of capitalism centered in social objectives, climate change, and all these kind of things which make our future extremely challenging. But there is one point in which I would like to stress before ending this meeting, which I think probably will deserve future analysis. We are in a real epochal change. It's more than crisis I used to have in the last 70 years. The impression I have really is that we are left in behind. 70 years, we were probably the most brilliant period of the history of humanity in terms of achievements in economic and social and in political fronts. Some of them were mentioned here. Really, we are confronted to epochal change. And being this the case, I cannot forget what was for my generation. I was brought up immediately after the war. I was educated after the war. What was the major illusion of our life, which was multilateralism, the fact that the United Nations was going to rule over a world ruled by common goals, by common objectives, by solidarity, et cetera, et cetera. Well, these things are starting in big crisis. We must accept that, very big crisis. I think we are entering into a period in which we are in a real epochal change. Well, being in Italy, we must remember what Gramsci said here in the 30s. The one epoch is ending and the other is beginning. Monsters appear on the table. And we are having a series of monsters today. I think the crisis in multilateral trade, for me, the WTO started to be born in my country, in Uruguay, in 1986, and we are seeing how difficult strains, starting by the war, the trade war between China and the United States. We see also the crisis in the Security Council. Things are happening in the world without really the United Nations being able to put a real input, making the solution as we dreamed after the war. We're looking to the things happening now anew, these novel global issues in the big technological enterprises trying to have their own power in political affairs. So altogether, I think we are entering into a period of change. My impression is that in this situation, probably something that should be kept in mind is to discuss these issues. Because really, in a way, this epochal change, we must remember what had been the last 70 years in the world. What happened what happened during the 1915 to 1945. This was an epochal change too. We don't expect to have this kind of turmoil, but it's enough to remember what were the difficulties we had. So my impression is just an invitation, what this brilliant meeting we had today, could we probably look into the future and put this idea, are we really making epochal change? If this is the case, what are the challenges? How we can put alive into that change the major values that are very much in this place where we are now, and how we can really look ahead in terms of preserving in those changes the need to have really values up in the list of our commitments to the future. That's all.
Thank you so much, Enrique. I think you sum up a lot of the things we discussed today. I don't know if anybody else would like to say something. Otherwise, I will turn to Kristalina Georgieva for your comments, please.
We have advanced quite with time, so I would strive to be very short. First, I take from here a remarkable consistency in views that are being expressed. From the very beginning with Joe Stiglitz's intervention through the day, Bruno Le Maire wasn't here in the morning, but what you were talking about is very consistent with what, broadly speaking, the tone and the substance of the discussion here has been. We are at the moment in our human history when we have to recognize that while the world we have is not entirely broken, it is also not quite what we need to sustain our future, and that changes are necessary, and we all have to be brave to march forward with these changes. Bruno, I talked about us at the fund, the criticality we assign to inequalities, to global cooperation I called it the globalization of hope versus the globalization of anxiety that we are witnessing, and climate action. And I think it would be fair to say that in different angles, we talked about the sustainability of our economies with a much broader brush than normally we would talk, thinking of the social fabric that is so critical to be strong for economies to perform well and for our planet to be there for our children and our grandchildren, to be a livable place for them. It is important that we recognize that there are two regions most represented here, Europe and Latin America. And actually, it was quite remarkable how much on the same page you have been. So if we are serious about alliances, we need to walk out of the room with some confidence that a common vision and action towards this vision is possible. So this is my first point. It is rather, I'm actually more optimistic in the end of the day than I was at the beginning because of this consistency of vision, including listening to the Holy Father. My second point is very straightforward. Time is not our friend. Enjoy the speed of change today. It will never be so slow in the future. We are faced with a rapidly accelerating world, and we have to square a circle that Jeff put for us, which is, how can we think long-term and provide policy certainty, especially on climate, long-term, when change is so fast? And that means for all of us policymakers, we do have to wrestle with creating a more agile policy environment that gives predictability, but is not rigid in a way that it is an obstacle to innovation and an obstacle of progress. And that is a different type of policy environment. And I can tell you from us, for the fund, our determination is to lean forward to face this new, more dynamic world and work with you so we can be this combination of reliable presence with agility and flexibility of how this engagement works. And that is my conclusion. Minister Guzman talked about the uniqueness of this meeting. It is actually very true. I have not heard in quite some time such a frank discussion on very important issues for the future of mankind. No, for the future of women and mankind. So thank you very much to the host. Please convey to the Holy Father that him coming added this yes we can ingredient that I think we all need. Yes, we can have a better world for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Cristalina. What a privilege to have you for the whole day. I think this is something we really appreciate profoundly. Let me turn quickly to Joseph Stiglitz for your comments, please. Close.
Yeah. Well, first, let me echo the thanks for the Pontifical Academy for organizing this. And it's a very striking mix of people that normally don't get together, and also remarkable consensus about what needs to be done. And let me just try to very quickly summarize to go and then respond a little bit further. That capitalism isn't serving our society, and that if we don't reform it, there will be severe consequences for our polity, as the Minister Omer pointed out. That what is needed is deep reforms. This is somebody said, an epical moment, so that it is really, the tweaks are not going to work, and the tweaks are important, improving education, there are lots of things that are important that need to be done, but those are much of what is often talked about are tweaks in the system and not the more fundamental reforms. I think, let me also highlight something the minister said, which is revolutions have almost always had disastrous consequences. And that's why evolution of the system is important. But what is needed is a dramatic evolution, and not a 130-year or 200-year evolution. When we think about what has happened in the last 40 years in the speed with which inequalities have risen, we realize how dramatic it is. And 30 years ago, we didn't fully understand the dangers of climate change. And we have put the world on the verge of extinction in 200 and some years. So the question is, the world is moving fast, and if we don't change it quickly, I think there can be very disastrous consequences. The third is that as we think about these reforms, markets, capitalism, firms are going to be part of it, but so is the state, so is civil society, so is a rich ecology of different kinds of institutions like cooperatives, non-governmental institutions. And so we really, as I said in my talk this morning, we really need to think about trying to get a better balance among these institutions. And different countries, the way that balance will work out will differ, and over time that will differ. But we have to begin with a recognition that it is a rebalancing that's required. And finally, I think we have to reimagine all of our roles of all of these institutions serving, at least in part, public purpose. That the idea that everybody should be focusing on their own self-interest and that will somehow lead to the well-being of society, I think that idea has been pretty well discredited. And so we really need to at least have most of our institutions, particularly our big corporations, our government, our NGOs, think about public purpose. So the remaining remarks, I want to focus on two public purposes that have been highlighted, inequality and climate. The inequality, first let me say that I think things, if they don't get better, if we don't do something of the kind that we were talking about, are likely to get much worse. That AI, robotization, the direction which the United States has been going, are all leading us to more and more inequality. And if you look at the trends, there's absolutely no reason to think that they're going to stop where they are and think we are moving towards a real dystopia. The second thing is that there are some important reforms that a number of people have called attention to. The growing risk of monopolization, particularly from the digital companies. In the United States, in sector after sector, there is growing concentration, not only in the digital, but it's especially in the digital, which is really distorting our economy. And it's, just to add to the list of the problems that the minister drew attention to, there are others like privacy, political manipulation, misinformation, that most of our governments are not doing very much about. And France has done something about it, and more countries need to do more about it. And the European directive is clearly out of date even before it's put in. And so there needs to be a framework, as Rohinda talked about this morning. Secondly, something that's not been emphasized, I think, enough is, and with the representative here from the ILO, is the role of collective bargaining and unionization. And some of the efforts that are now being discussed in the European Union to try to strengthen both unionization and restructure collective bargaining to get more meaningful outcomes out of it, I think are moves in the right direction. But taking actions to try to make sure that there is full employment, for instance, and are very important. And the Growth and Stability Pact, as it's been interpreted, has been a constraint in many countries. And there is one interesting idea that's being discussed, particularly here in Italy, which I think could be a powerful way of linking the two areas, is called the replacing, they used to be talked about the golden rule, that you could break the 3% deficit if you invested. And now people are talking about the green rule, that you could break that 3% deficit if you're investing for green, making green investments. And when you think about it, it both moves the economy towards full employment, particularly in countries where there is a lack of aggregate demand, and at the same time is helping achieve a global public good, which is climate change. And so it seems to me that if there's a real commitment towards zero emissions by 2050, this is something that ought to be done very quickly. And working with the European Investment Bank gives you a little, some some financial space to do it. But really, going towards the green rule would be a particular instrument that I think could be helpful. The final thing I want to talk about on inequality is something that's come up a number of times, and Pope Francis raised it, is debt. Because the way we handle debt can have enormous effects for inequality across countries and inequality in countries, the amounts of suffering. We know what happens if you don't do it well. We know the disastrous effects. I mean, these are really, if you look around countries where it's not been done well, the effects have really been disastrous. We know that the standard way that it's been done has not worked. And so there needs to be a real change in the way debt restructuring goes. We know that there are fundamental problems in the whole debt market and the way debt negotiations go on. Just to give you one example, there's a lack of transparency. When the people come to the table, there is typically no disclosure of their positions, for instance, on CDSs. So you don't know the people you're negotiating with, do they really want an agreement, or would they actually prefer things to blow up? And there is no set of international standards that would require that kind of disclosure. I mean, really, you talk about transparency and markets, this is the least transparent, and the result of this is the least efficient possible kind of process. We know in the United States there have been cases where companies have gone bankrupt because it was the interest of people who were at the table wanted it to go bankrupt because they had so many CDSs. They made more money as the lender when the company went bankrupt because they were more than 100% insured against the bankruptcy. And this was not disclosed. So we know that that market is not working. We also know that many of the creditors and many of the people who are creditors now because they bought them from other parties are not really, you might say, fair players. We know about the vulture funds, and you know probably most of you knows the standard joke about calling the vulture funds that name is an insult to the bird, because at least the vulture is an important part of the ecology. And these persons, the vulture funds, serve no socially productive purpose in our society. But it's even worse. There are countries like Malaysia and Mozambique where major international banks have induced them to get excessively indebted through corrupt practices, and now the countries have to repay this debt, which the money never got to the citizens of the country. And so this is, again, something that where the debt problem is not been resolved, and the potential cost to these countries is enormous, and we're asking ordinary citizens to pay back these corrupt, Goldman Sachs, Credit Suisse. I mean, we could name lots of the banks who've done this. So we need a better institutional framework, and as the Pontiff emphasized, this is both an economic issue and it's a moral issue. And when we judge the nature of capitalism, how this is handled will be among the things that will be in people's mind when they think about how capitalism functions. Let me talk just very quickly about climate change. And there have been a number of aspects of climate, of the mechanisms for dealing with climate change that have been talked about. The use of prices as a signal is very important. But I want to emphasize three other things. One, you need regulations. And regulations have gotten a bad name, but there are a lot of simple regulations, like no coal-burning electric generating plants. That's not a hard regulation to implement. There needs to be public investment. If we don't have public transport, people will use cars, and it's not a matter of choice. They have no alternative. So having public investment is very important. Thirdly, institutions are important. And this is where the development banks are really important. That they do have a longer-term view. Our financial sector tends to be short-term, and I'll come back to that in a second. But the development banks are there partly because they were created with that longer-term view, and they are playing a very important role. And maybe I should note here the very major change in perspective on development banks reflecting this change in perspective on capitalism. 20 years ago, as part of the Washington Consensus, there was a broad denigration of development banks, even from the development banks themselves. The World Bank criticized other development banks, saying that they weren't good. The World Bank was good. But now, the World Bank recognizes that it's a development bank, and it's done a good job, I think, and it recognizes the important role of other development banks. And I think development banks really are important. And it's interesting, even the United States, New York State has created a development bank for climate. And a number of U.S. states have created development banks for climate, specifically for climate. And so I think we should think about this important instrument. Finally, when I talk about institutions, the private sector is an important institution. And the question is, how do we make the private sector think more long-term? And I think that is one of the fundamental institutional reforms as we think about reforming capitalism. And there are a number of ideas on the table, like loyalty shares, having more people on the board. If you own a company's shares for a longer time, you have more voice encouraging a whole set of reforms in fiduciary responsibility that we talked about earlier on the part of pension funds and endowments that would encourage long-term thinking, changing corporate governance to putting long-term thinking, creating new forms like B corporations, and in Europe there are other forms of corporation with a public purpose. So I think changing the institutional arrangement to encourage more long-term thinking can be an important part of moving us towards addressing climate change. And finally, part of the rules within a country are the international context, and I think we have to think about that a lot, the international rules. And it came up a little bit earlier in the day when, in the context of cross-border taxes to encourage green. A number of years ago, in 2006, I wrote a book called Making Globalization Work, where I argued for cross-border taxes. And at the time I wrote the book, I did go to the trouble of talking to the WTO judges about their views and looking a little bit about the case, about the case law. And I became convinced that that cross-border taxes are WTO consistent. There is a famous case that ironically, that the US brought called the shrimp turtle case, where the WTO ruled that the US imposed restrictions on shrimp that were imported, that were caught in nets that were endangering endangered species of turtle. And the US put a restriction on that, and the WTO ruled that when there's an international agreement, like cities in that case, and like Paris today, it is perfectly permissible to impose environmental restrictions, and that the only requirement is that it has to be universal. You can't say, I'll impose it against Thailand, but not against Mexico. So you have to say, you have to be honest about it. It's not a protectionist measure, it's about the environmental. And so it seems to me it is important for Europe and for other countries to impose these cross-border taxes, because they change the international environment that provides incentives for what you might call rogue countries, what I call it in my book, rogue countries, who do not want to comply with international standards, to comply with them. And while there will be some threatening and saber-rattling by some countries, as France learned in the case of the digital tax, I think solidarity among the rest of the world is necessary to go ahead, and I congratulate Europe for going ahead and showing the resolve to do it, because it is unconscionable that the richest companies of the world should not be taxed, and it's unconscionable that the polluting a country that doesn't regulate carbon should pollute the rest of the world. And if we're going to have international solidarity, which is one of the themes, we have to work together to try to create the right incentives everywhere for creating a better world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Kristalina wants to make a very important comment.
I hate to do that, but I'm provoked. And now I would end up not quite entirely agreeing with Joe. And what I want to say is I'm all for climate action. I think Europe has a unique chance to turn climate into the silver bullet that may unleash growth, innovation, productivity, and even boost inflation. I'm all for that. I'm actually, I'm very fiscally conservative, but I think that this green rule may not be a bad idea in the first years, not forever, but as you're boosting, as you are shooting your silver bullet. I would be very careful with going at this point of history with what could be seen as protectionist measure at the time when trade, we are barely holding it to be an engine of growth. I am concerned of timing, not whether the concept of imposing a cross-border tax is a wrong concept, but the timing of discussing it, in my honest opinion, is the wrong timing, and I don't think I need to say more on that. I just felt I had to pronounce myself as a proponent of trade and growth on that matter. Joe.
So I don't view this,
Lovingly, very
okay,
well.
I don't view this as a protectionist measure, and the issue
You
with the
don't
timing is a
understand.
delicate one, which I leave to the political people
Yeah.
Well, I
to make
invite
final
both of you.
judgment on.
You don't, but many developing countries will.
Feel that,
I can
right.
tell you this. And do you really want to throw gasoline on the trade delicacy fire right now? So that's my caution, not whether, but when. Okay, Jeff, sorry.
Thank you, Kristalina, but let me tell you,
this.
this is the fear of some developing countries, I must admit. But anyway, we can discuss over dinner. Jeffrey.
Okay, just a little more gasoline on the fire.
You're the master.
Yes. Thank you, Monsignor, again for a wonderful day, and to everybody for a fantastic discussion. Multilateralism is not under threat per se in most of the world. It is under threat because of the United States. And I want to say this clearly because it's not a game and it's not to provoke, it's to discuss. Okay, the U.S. was the predominant economic and technological power of the world for decades. This is no longer the case. It is a powerful country economically and technologically, but it is no longer a dominant power. The European Union is a larger market. China is a comparable market. And the spread of technology is worldwide. The U.S. is by far the most powerful military country in the world, though it learns war after war that the military can solve no political problems whatsoever. We have 6,000 nuclear warheads, 800 military bases around the world. We are involved in 14 shooting wars right now, have instigated multiple wars. The U.S. is a problem. It became a far more significant problem with Donald Trump. He may or may not be president after November, but the U.S. became vastly more complicated for the world since 2017. These are not polite things to say. Nobody likes to say them, but I want to say them to explain a few things that I think are extremely important. The U.S. has blocked every multilateral initiative of recent years. It is the only country pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. It is the only country that pulled out of the JCPOA agreement with Iran. There is not a China-U.S. trade war. There is a U.S. trade war on China. That is different. This was an unpremeditated attack because of China's rising technological capacity. Have no doubt about it. What is this about Huawei or about ZTE or about others? It is because the U.S. realizes that China is gaining massive technological capability in artificial intelligence and other security-related areas because China's talented, smart, minting hundreds of thousands of PhDs every year, and that's how the world works now. There's no monopoly of knowledge. There's no monopoly of talent. This is driving U.S. strategists crazy because U.S. grand strategy is based on primacy. And that's not some fantasy of mine. This is in our documents, our doctrines, one after another. There can be no U.S. primacy in the world anymore that is safe for the world. That's not how the world works anymore. but that is how U.S. policy works. The U.S. is attacking the digital taxation. It has taken tremendous, disastrous cuts to corporate taxation, which is blowing up the worldwide taxation on companies. It has dismembered the WTO. There is no appellate process now. It now claims that it's going to adjudicate exchange rates and put unilateral tariffs on against countries that the U.S. alone deems to be manipulating the exchange rate. Well, I know our Treasury, and with all respect, they don't have a clue about how foreign exchange markets work. This is, of course, pure politics, top to bottom. It has nothing to do with anything meritorious other than the idea of temporary advantage in some geopolitical contest and context. Last month, when Iraq said it wanted the U.S. military forces out, if you can imagine, the Treasury said, we will confiscate your foreign exchange reserves at the New York Fed if you persist in pushing our troops out. This is thuggery. This is a complete violation of every international rule. This is truly what we are facing. And I'm sorry to say it. It's my country. I'm not very happy to say it. But this is an imperial power in decline. And it is a dangerous country right now. It will be absolutely dangerous if Trump wins re-election. Now, okay, you don't have to say anything. No one likes to say these things, but this is actually important. The world can't stop because of the United States. We can't stop the Paris Climate Agreement. We can't stop having G20 meetings. We can't stop having tax reform. We can't stop having digital taxation. We can't have the United States adjudicate exchange rates. That's the job of the IMF. We can't not have an appellate system at WTO. We cannot have one country that is 4.2% of the world population and still 15% of world output, but not 50% of world output, decide on the international structure on which the other 96% depend for their lives now. Moreover, in the United States, Mr. Trump does not have a majority backing. So it is quirks of many things that give unilateral power to a small coterie of people to dismantle the international system right now. What I would just beg of you who are running the international system, have an open discussion. Don't be cowed by bullying. And let's proceed, because there is not a global crisis about multilateralism. There is a U.S. relentless daily pressure on multilateralism. This is quite different. I am traveling all around the world, month after month, meeting senior officials in every part of the world. There is no attack on multilateralism that I can discern anywhere. None. There is fear of the United States. This is different. Well, that's what bullies do. Bullies threaten you. You step a little bit ahead, you'll get pummeled. But if the whole world says, we continue our discussion, we continue the fight against climate change, you can do what you want. But we continue WTO, we continue climate change, we even have discussions at the fund and the bank. It's a little bit harder at the bank, but it's true. It's a whole board. Last time I checked, the United States, it's 16% of the vote, I believe, not 84, and there's another 84%. The General Assembly routinely votes 185 against the United States on almost everything right now. one after another. It's the US and 2 or 3 allied countries. And I know how that works because the ambassadors tell me about the threats that the US is putting on, direct, vulgar threats. And I know about it one by one by one. So we are not in a crisis of multilateralism. And it's a bluff, like Bully's bluff. The US cannot blow up its own economy the way that they pretend they can. But if every country backs down one by one, then the bully gets the way. These issues are too important to be determined by Mr. Trump. It's not only Mr. Trump, because US unilateralism has been in vogue now for about 20 years. Actually, after 1992, the US went crazy, thinking it had, quote, won the world, and then it believed its own press release that it was the new Rome and that it was the sole superpower and that it was the indispensable nation. So this has been true since 1992. But it got a lot worse right now because the overt hostility against everybody, the threats against everybody, the lawlessness against everybody is completely unprecedented. And it's an abuse of our laws in the United States every day because Trump has none of this authority. This is under national emergency legislation that he's taking these actions. How can he threaten France with a tariff on wine because France rightly says that there should be a digital tax? You think that's an American law? Of course not. This is lawlessness, complete lawlessness. So we had a good discussion today. There is really a big consensus on this world for a decent world. It's not unanimous, but let's not depend on unanimity. Let's move forward when a large part of the world wants to do the right thing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. You vote, we don't. So that's a little bit the problem, but thank you for that. Before turning the floor to our host, and that is Monsignor Marcelo Sanchez Sorondo, I want just to say a couple of things, and one of them is thank you. Thank you very much. I think it has been. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to the hosts. I want to tell our very good friend Gustavo Vélez for organizing this wonderful occasion, wonderful day. I want to thank really la Academia Pontificia, who has Pontificia Academia de las Ciencias Sociales, and want to thank very much for your, I would say, for the warmth and for the openness to have this very frank discussion. I think we go away with a sense of urgency, with the need for hope. We have to recreate capitalism. I think we're not giving up, but we need to change it, definitely. And we hope, Jeffrey, that you can convince your fellow Americans that we need multilateralism. As a Mexican, it's very little what I can do, but I can try, no question about it. But the thing is that I think we have the institutions, we have the leadership, we need a coalition. We need another meeting, Gustavo, and colleagues from the Vatican. I think we can have a whole day discussion about this very point, whether we have a multilateral world or not, whether Europe can come in and help us. We really need you guys. In Latin America, we definitely feel that way. But honestly, I think these new forms of solidarity is what we need in the world. To think, to be together, to form coalitions of the like-minded. Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you to the government of Argentina. Thank you to all of you for coming the whole day. And let me then turn to Monsignor, back to you, Monsignor Marcelo Sánchez Sorondo. Muchas gracias, muchas gracias.
Thank you. I want to say something about hope, because we have here ideas, new ideas. We have here very important institutions, and we have here the persons that can change the world. We have the Pope, and we have here many important governors, ministers, and we, as said the Pope in his speech, we have the possibility to change things. So, like with Pope John Paul II changed the world, really with his position and his magisterium, but also his praxis. We think that we need to change, and we have the possibility to change. And of course, we have we believe in the providence of God, and we think that just the providence can help us in this moment, and maybe the situation to suffer Argentina and other countries is just the moment to prove and the moment to change. So I am very happy with this meeting. That was one of the most beautiful meetings that we organized in so not too much time, in 1 month or 2 months, with the addition of Cristalina, that I am very, very thankful, because he came 2 times in so brief time. So really, we know his will, and generosity to change things. And of course, our academician, Stiglitz, that for many years enlightened the academy, and of course, Jeffrey Sachs, to put in contact with the But I want to give the door to our president, that so can say more things important to me. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Marcelo. Just a word, because time is already up. The Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences is very grateful to each one of you for your active and stimulating participation. So I want to reciprocate the thanks that Alicia addressed. It's not only that you should be grateful to the Academy, but also the vice versa. The Academy will continue to organize this type of gathering and workshop, because we believe that that is part of our fundamental mission. This is the format. It's quite strange, as we know, but that is why the biodiversity, the presence of academic policymakers, expression of the civil society, it's really a way to organize our thought. And let me conclude by saying that where there is a will, there is always a way. So thank you very much again, and let's down to dinner.